Alright, so this one was another one that was suggested relatively recently, and we'll be taking a look at, I guess you could say, women in small towns who work in pie stores, depending on the word you use to describe pizza, I guess, and how they basically just want out, and they want another life for themselves, or to start their life. So I think I want to start with Waitress, because I love Waitress a lot. And it is brought to us by Adrian Shelley, who is the writer and director, who sadly is one of the cases where you hear a lot of talk these days about female directors and how some of them don't quite have the spotlight that they probably should. And every time I hear that discussion, one thing that comes to mind is how tragic it is that this is the only movie we will see Shelley do as a director, given that she was killed right before it was released. And it's probably better to get that out of the way first when you talk about this movie so that you can quickly get to how much joy the movie can bring, and kind of help her legacy along in that way, whether it be just how the movie has never lost its touch now that it's 13 years old, on top of the fact of the giant Broadway show that it spawned that only just closed earlier this year in January after like over 1,500 performances. And she had another posthumous movie that she wrote that her co-star in this, Cheryl Hines, went on to direct, which was Serious Moonlight with Meg Ryan. And yes, and you might remember Shelley before like the writing and directing game, where she got her start in a couple of Hal Hartley movies, and there was that sort of teaming there that set her off. And then you've basically got this setup that reminds you maybe of like Steel Magnolias, only with pies, which is weird to say when Julia Roberts is sitting right here in the other movie. But the great thing right at the start that is the center of this movie is Carrie Russell and this amazing performance from her, with this character that is basically her entire being revolves around the existence of pies and making pies, which sounds like a weird concept when you just say it, but then when you actually watch it and you get the visuals that this movie gives, this is one of those movies in an array of movies, whether it be like, Babette's Feast or Ang Lee's earlier movies like Eat, Drink, Marry, Woman or The Wedding Banquet. Those are movies that are just known for being appetizing, and the way they like shoot the food in it and the way it's prepared in such a way that it's indescribable. These opening scenes, even the opening credit sequence alone, where it's just various pies being made, and you can really see how that's kind of the heart of the movie and how much effort they put into showing that off. Like I said, something that may sound bizarre if you just describe it. When you see these pies, you get, yes, the movie has found the right place the right way to express itself, and for the main character to express herself through this. And what we have at the start of this, as far as why she needs to get away or why she needs to start another life, is her husband Earl, who is played by the immensely underappreciated Jeremy Sisto, who is probably one of the most consistent and reliable actors out there. And this character, not only is it, because in another case, it would be like, there's the character that has the asshole husband, and it's pretty much just kind of a device in the plot to give sympathy to the other character. But they make him so realistically shitty, in a way that, and there's so much we learn about him through how she behaves, rather than before we even really see the scenes where we see just how bad he is and how hard he is to live with. Where we have, when she first finds out that she's pregnant in like the opening scenes, and she's talking about how it's probably happened when she was drunk, and she does really stupid things when she's drunk, like sleep with her husband. And then the way the Cheryl Hines and Adrian Shelley, her friends that work there alongside her, chime in on this also, and how they say like, "Oh God, I would not trade places with you." And it's like, I may be as bad off as I am, I'm still glad. I would never trade places with you. That's just the way it is. And they're almost, you could say, good enough friends to be able to say that. There's nothing. Earl is so shitty. It's not even hidden. He himself doesn't even try to hide it at the end when he's at a public gathering and causes a scene and pisses off Andy Griffith in the process. But now going on that, yeah, talking about like the pies being her happy place, pretty much, because there is, like, they say that and we see the pies being made in the opening titles and all that. But the thing is it's the moment where she's, I mean, and we see a pie being made and how that's how she deals with it. Like, she thinks of the different pies recipes for her different scenarios in life. And we get a glimpse of that, like, after she's taken the pregnancy test. But I feel like the way they demonstrate that the best, even after that scene, is the scene where she's making the pie just by herself. And we actually get to see her, like, physically making the pie and how that sort of makes, and that's a lot of the great stuff that's in Carrie Russell's performance, is how we can see this in her just by watching her make a pie without even her having to say anything. And so that's such a strength of the movie. And then you look at, you know, all the different sort of side characters. Shelley in particular does stand out, not just being the writer and director also, but you'll also notice with her being the writer, there's a lot of, like, sort of almost heartbreaking self-deprecation in the writing of her character, where she talks about, like, she has, like, the pastiest skin ever. And she even, like, breaks the fourth wall to say that she has pasty skin. She, like, looks right into the camera. And then when she gets the sort of somewhat makeover right before her date, and she says, oh my god, look what you've done. You've made me almost pretty. And it's, and it's stuff like that that really actually adds, like, a sort of, like I said, that's the brilliance of how Shelley played the character. Was it comes off very light and comedic and jokey, but it almost adds, like, a heartbreaking layer to it also, because you're never quite sure just how sincere it is or not coming from her when she does the self-deprecating, or how light it actually is. But the fact that it's able to sort of come off in that sort of light and jokey way helps the sort of tone of the movie go on also. And you've also got, and that's also kind of the contrast to what Hines is doing, where Hines is just sort of a flat-out comedic character. Even, like, the turns in her story end up going in comedic directions. When it turns out she's, like, banging the boss and all that, being an almost like a twist in the movie. Even when you've seen it more than once, you can kind of tell the clues are pretty blatant. Where it's like when she's talking about her secret, and then, like, the very next, before there's even a cut, she, like, runs into the boss, and there's, like, a quick moment of tension. And it's like that's the telling moment of what that reveal ends up being. And going back to Shelley's character, there's also the presence of Eddie Jameson, who some people will probably remember from the Ocean movies. And it's hilariously, because there's two different kinds of pathetic in this movie, and it's from the guys, because you've got Earl, who is, like, relentlessly pathetic, like, in a really increasingly disgusting way the more we see him and learn about him. And with this Eddie Jameson character, who is Shelley's date, who starts off as almost a stalker type, but she ultimately ends up falling for because of his persistence, he is very comedically pathetic. Like, it's a hilarious performance, and his scenes really work in that way, and sort of add to the background of, like, the quirkiness of the characters without being irritatingly quirky the way you might imagine in a lesser-made movie with characters like this, and just a setting like this in general. And then I mentioned Andy Griffith in passing, and of course I love that he seems like just sort of a background character. Like, he's the dude that owns the shop, technically. But he just pretty much comes in to provide, like, cynical commentary and get his pie and then be on his way. And then, like, the way he progresses, and the more we kind of peel away from his character a little bit, where Carrie Russell's pretty much the only one he, like, really lets in a way that we see kind of another side to him, but the cynical side is also always there. And of course he's going to have dialogue and speaking points that are very much outside of what he may have said while living in Mayberry. So that's always fun to see as well. And then, obviously, we introduce a character that's going to completely set, like, a sort of plot off, I guess you could say, which is the Doctor played by Nathan Fillion, which this is a really, I think, what Nathan Fillion does in this might sound almost extreme, given the kind of movie it is and the kind of role it is, but Nathan Fillion does something with this character that is practically flawless in his performance, because this character is a really hard character to pull off, I imagine, when you see him in a script. Because he's got to be charming in a way, like charming in a way you'd probably expect a central love interest to be. But this dude is also so incredibly awkward, and they have to call out his awkwardness multiple times because it's that bad. But they're always he somehow maintains a charm to him to where we never quite he remains awkward, but at the same time we get what she sees in him and how quickly she sees it in him. And it makes their relationship just kind of happen so gradually, even if quickly. We're kind of totally behind it, even despite the moral dilemma that's at the center of this whole thing. And it brings up some interesting moments between them, like the first time they kiss, when she's walking away, and he says, "Don't walk away from me," and she like stops immediately. And in this particular moment, always really stood out to me because you can take it in two different ways, and they're totally the opposite. Like one is really charming and romantic, and the other is alarming. When she's walking away from Nathan Fillion and he says, "Don't walk away from me," and she stops immediately, you could take that as because she likes him so much and she wants to stay and see what's going to happen and if this kiss is going to happen or whatever, and that's why she stops, because she wants to, because she doesn't want to walk away from him. Or it's also kind of brings in the whole vibe of how Earl has almost maybe shaped her to just even the words coming out of my mouth sound so sleazy, to do what she's told. And I don't so that's a moment that I've always wondered what direction it actually goes in, like what the intention of that moment was. Or maybe that's just the way it was written, was he says, "Don't walk away," and she doesn't walk away, and that's it. But I've always taken it as, I imagine it's got to be one or the other of those things. And I like to think it's because she wanted to. Because the attraction to him is obviously very strong, to the point that she drops her moral guard almost instantly. And like I said, the charm of him actually works. But I think another thing that's really interesting about this love story between her and the Doctor is that we know right away that he's married, because we get him wearing his wedding ring gets its own shot when they're waiting at the bus stop. And so it's something we know very early. It's his second scene. And the thing about this is, like I said, the moral dilemma this kind of brings up, but it's like, we never see his wife until like the very end, and that might seem like almost like a cop-out, because if a wife were present, it would basically be, in another movie, if the wife were present, her personality would be the deciding factor on if the two of them are going to end up together or not. Because if she's like really nice and really sweet, there's a good chance that it might actually be the Doctor that ends up being not who we think he is, and then they end up not getting together. Or it could be that the wife, it comes off like really malicious, and he seems like he's in a bad relationship and all that. And so it's like, oh, well, of course they're going to end up together, because he's got to get away from that, and she's got to get away from hers, and there it is. It's right there. It's the math of the romantic comedy. But the fact that we don't see her at all until the very end means that through their entire relationship, we have more or less an unbiased approach. Like, we don't have something to go on to decide if we think it's right or not, apart from the fact that they're both married. That's the obvious one. But I mean, as far as using the other characters besides the two of them as the deciding factor on if this relationship is going to work or not. Like I said, it may seem like a cop-out to keep her out of the story for so long, but I think that's a really interesting and sort of new approach to take that, because this regardless of the moral stance, this is the setup to so many romance stories, and to see that in sort of a different fashion and take that in that approach is really refreshing. So especially when the characters are so likable, even if like their attraction feels undeniable, even if we know much more about her side than we do about his side and what's going on behind their own closed doors in their marriages. So I thought that was a really refreshing take on the way to handle that, and the way they also add, like talking about the way their relationship wins you over, even though they're both married, is like I said, just the charm of his character and the way they come together feels so natural. It's that one moment when they are talking about how she said she's never really felt like she's had a best friend outside of her mom, and he feels like that person. It's like that kind of adds a whole other sort of thing to it, like a sort of, I don't know what's the word. I can't say innocent because they're both married, but what's the word I'm looking for? I don't know, but you get what I mean. There's something pure there in a sense that she sees him as both a best friend and what it is they're doing outside of their marriages. So, and that's the thing too, is on top of that being the central love story and the side plot with Cheryl Hines cheating on her husband with the boss, and the boss is in a sense cheating on someone else to do that also, it could easily be mistaken for a movie that like advocates like adultery. But that's the thing about it though, is they don't ignore, the moral dilemma of it, especially given how it ends and how their relationship ends, and the fact when his wife is brought into it. But it feels less like it's pro adultery for whoever would think that, and more so like getting yourself out of the unhappy situations, like not putting yourself in the unhappy situations where you have, like, where she somehow ended up in a marriage with a guy like Earl, and she just stays. Like, she's obviously got these big plans and all that, and now she feels trapped with the pregnancy and all that, but it's like, to be able to escape from a situation like that, or from, even not necessarily that situation, but the feeling that that situation puts in you, and escaping that, and becoming a better person for it. I think that's really what it's getting at more, and just the whole idea of finding something to live for, which for the most part is pretty much discussed between the characters, particularly with those last few Andy Griffith scenes, where we're reaching somebody that's at the end of his life versus somebody that's potentially starting a new one, and the way those conversations happen really kind of bring these points home in a way. So there is that, and to be able to, almost makes the movie even more admirable to be able to take that sort of approach to this kind of material, because there's a lot of adultery that goes on in standard romantic comedies that's not addressed or not addressed very well, and I feel like this handles all that stuff as well as it can, really, as well as the whole traditional setup can. So there is that whole thing, and then we get to the ending, of course, where just about everything is satisfying, where Andy Griffith leaves her the check, and she tells Earl to fuck off, and she'll flatten him if he comes back, and then the moments when we see her just with her child, just growing up, and it's like she certainly doesn't need Earl, and she didn't need Nathan Fillion either. It could just be the two of them, and they can have their shop and all that stuff. And it's the scenes as we're watching kind of the kid grow as it gets into those. We're kind of montaging into the end credits, and it just kind of always gets me. Like, it feels me with something. I think it's, as I know as cheesy as it is. And you could say there's like a cheesiness to the whole ending, but that's really what works about it, especially with the sort of traditional small town setting. But also, like, it's the matching outfits. I know that sounds cheesy, but there's something about that that's always just like, that's just really nice. It's just an amazing ending, and I really love it. So, yes, and so I'm glad, even though we weren't able to get another movie with Shelley directing, because God knows what other amazing stuff she would have done with clearly what she showed here, and so much experience in her career before she directed a movie. And it's like, it's clear how much experience she had, whether it be in being an actress and becoming characters or writing, that she was able to tell this story so incredibly well and in such a way, and go into the things that it does and not lose itself in the process is really nice. So, yeah, and then have a legacy that goes on through this movie alone, with a Broadway show that lasted as long as it did and did as well as it did. Is just a really rewarding thought. So that's, yes, I pretty much love everything about this movie. I kind of always did. Like I was 17 or 18 when it came out, and you'd think at that age I would have been a bit more cynical about a movie like this, but no, I always loved this movie when I first saw it, and still now, 13 years after its release. So, yes. And so to go on to Mystic Pizza, which I don't know if it's because we just revisited this story last year, but upon revisiting Mystic Pizza recently, I almost kind of felt like it had almost like a Little Women vibe to it, a little bit like a modern Little Women vibe. Even though there's three people at the core of it, and two of them are sisters, but the third one might as well be another sister. Um, and we have a really likable trio here of young characters who have just graduated, and they're at that, it's that familiar territory of them being at the just after high school graduation and now going into the real world, but the story is kind of the first stepping stone of preparing them for whatever their lives are probably going to be, as they go out, like what their lives are going to be after the movie's over. And the three we get here are Annabeth Gish, Lily Taylor, and of course Julia Roberts in the movie that pretty much set her off. She had done that movie Satisfaction before this, but I think most people assumed this was her first movie. But it, with how Satisfaction is what it's the kind of movie that it is. This might as well have been. We'll say, like, for Julia Roberts' sake, we'll say this was Julia Roberts' first real movie. Um, so, as far as them being likable characters in their setup, despite the fact that they do have many problems that eventually cause conflict, of course, um, we have Annabeth Gish, who's trying to basically work at... She's basically the... I struggle to say the brain of the group because it makes it sound like the other two would be idiots, but she's like... That's basically her thing. Because she's got the whole Yale thing going on. She wants to be an astronomer. And right now she's trying to juggle all this stuff and the pizza place job while also being a babysitter. And there's this opening scene where, with the babysitting scenes, where we see her just immediately start like reading to the kid, and the kid like immediately takes to her. And that scene kind of in itself says so much about her already. And it's you could say it's set up for her and the dad to have like, you know, the attraction to start off that. But I think it says about her a lot about her as a character, kind of at the start, that we can carry throughout this. And their relationship, the relationship between her and the girl, is one of the more appealing aspects of her storyline. Like maybe even more so than the whole her and the dad thing that's going on. And then you've got Lily Taylor, who's here trying to deal with Vincent D'Onofrio, who is obsessed with the idea of marrying her after their first wedding, goes awry during the opening credits, where she faints at the altar and decides that she doesn't want to do this, even though she's still really into him. And then there's Julia Roberts, who's basically got... She's the sister with, like, the tougher exterior, and she's got the coolness about her. There's that shot of her at the pool table that's, like, probably her star-making shot, where she's bent over the table and she, like, looks up at the dude before she takes the shot. Is a really famous shot in her career. And she's compared to Paul Newman in the... I want to say she's compared to Paul Newman in The Hustler when the girl makes that reference, but this was only 2 years after The Color of Money, so it could be either one. But that's where her coolness factor is at, from the people that see her around. And the thing about this is that they all sort of have... Like, these stories between the three girls could all be stories that worked on their own, probably. Like, in their own movie. And I think that's a real strength of the movie, the fact that we're going back and forth with these, because you would think, if you're focusing on this many characters, there'd be at least one that has the sort of lackluster story. But not really. You could say there's maybe one that has, like, less depth than the others, maybe, depending on where you're coming from. But it's, like, you have the whole, like with Annabeth Gish, you have the girl who's clearly very smart, but sort of falling into a sort of naive situation, and it's like she's still kind of, you can tell she's, for the most part, like as far as, you know, education wise, she's ready to go out into the world of where she's going to go, but she's still making this very sort of high school mistake with this dad that's married. A relationship between the two of them that is not too dissimilar from the way they sort of gradually came together, the way Kerry Russell and Nathan Fillion do in Waitress. And then you've got the Lily Taylor, Vincent D'Onofrio thing, which feels almost like a slapstick comedy about commitment. And then you've got the Julia Roberts thing, where she's like kind of the sort of like bombshell type, I guess you could call her. And she's falling in with the dude that maybe has some red flags going on that she's too naive in the moment to acknowledge more than she probably should. And then that's... And like I said, and they kind of all... I was talking about Annabeth Gish really falling into the sort of naive trap, but that's really happening with all three of them, because I was talking about Julia Roberts' dude having the red flags. There's also the Lily Taylor thing, where she's kind of... where D'Onofrio's the one that really wants to commit, and she's the one that's like just in it for the sex, and it's like they've got to decide what they're gonna do, and it's like with this relationship, and you can kind of see where they're both coming from. Like, they're both being childish in a way, but they're both also... like, they can either go their own way or commit, and you can see the conflict. Like I said, that one could be its own movie, really. And then they all kind of have their big individual moments through them. Sometimes it could be a really big scene, or sometimes it could be kind of a small moment, but they each have their own memorable little set pieces once we get to the center of the movie, where we have... Julia Roberts and her dude have the moment that's like, it's like a twist on the scene in It Happened One Night, the hitchhiking scene, that doesn't go quite the way you expect it to, especially if you've seen It Happen One Night, so... and then there's the moment when she has him, like, follow the trail of clothes to seduce him, and it's like, that's something that feels like something out of a classic romance movie. So it's like they sort of almost parody the classic romance movie, and then they kind of do something that feels like it'd be right at home in one, but they are able to do both effectively and make both work, which is really great about that. And then, like I said, the Lily Taylor D'Onofrio thing is pretty much flat-out comedy, almost, where we have this scene where they are getting ready to do it, but then he's held back because of his beliefs, so they're getting ready to do it. He's practically got his pants around his ankles, and he stares right in the face of a Jesus statue. And then, obviously, and then the parents come down, and it's a whole thing. It's right out of a teen comedy, jumping back and forth between, you know, a classic romance movie, what Julia Roberts is living in, and then teen with an older guy problem that, you know, Kat, the Annabeth Gish character, is going through. And then you got this one. But then there's a moment that Lily Taylor has that's amazing, that finally sort of grounds her story as well as it's going to get grounded. And kind of takes it away from the almost slapsticky vibe that it takes on, and the almost flat-out comedic vibe that it takes on. And it's the moment when he pretty much breaks it off with her, and she goes back to the pizza place and basically tries to play it off like she's the one that broke up with him. And she just has this sort of meltdown where she's making up this story of what happened and how the breakup happened. And after a while, it's almost like she's having a combating conversation with herself. And it's like, it's an amazing scene, like, performance-wise, but also there's, like, a comedic touch to it, but we also know it's the character at her breaking point, and it's, like, basically the peak of her conflict in the whole movie. And just all these things come together for this scene, and it's really just her pretty much doing a one-woman show for this scene. And it's really spectacular. And then you've got... like I was talking about with the Annabeth Gish character, where it's basically what we were talking about with Russell and Fillion and Waitress, where it's like, we know there is an issue here with the whole the guy is married thing, and in this case, it's not her coming from the same side. So it's almost, you're not really sure who it's damnable to more. But then again, like, you know, at least Kat has that sort of still naive thing, and we know she's smarter than this, but we know that love is blinding her and making her do the, well, maybe he'll get divorced thing, which we know is probably not true. But the way she's able to play that up, to where we can feel like we get where she's coming from, because when I was talking about her basically being the smarts of all this, is the fact that she's surrounded by characters, she's surrounded by people in her life that she has seems to have trouble connecting with, like even her own sister a lot of the time. Don't feel like they're on the same page, and so the way it almost makes you forget there's a wife involved when you see them sort of talking and how much that goes. But for the most part, you get the sense of she's way out of her element, she's way in over her head, and this is going to be bad for both of them if this goes into too much. And the way her performance is able to show off that without it feeling like it's deviating too much, because it could feel like a random deviation from her character just for the sake of moving a story along, but she makes it feel like it's just really just a being blinded by love thing, and an almost relatable thing, to where it helps the conflict feel, yeah, not too forced. And that's kind of what the movie's really good about, was you've got three different stories going on between these three girls, so eventually all of them are going to reach a conflict, and you would expect, with the kind of movie it is maybe, and the situations that they're in, that these conflicts that come will be really convoluted, because that's just what we come to expect. But the thing about it is, there's an extra, real human thing brought to the cat storyline, where when once the wife comes back and she kind of has her, oh god, and she finally comes down to like, oh my god, what did I think that was going to be, and it kind of, the smarts come back to her, and like the blinders of love kind of fall down, and then it's this emotionally devastating thing. And after her and Daisy have had the fight, and Daisy is now the source of comfort, and this cry that Kat has is like so devastatingly real, and like there's no like artificial beauty about this. It's not like it's not like the movie One Tier thing or anything. This is like a full on realistic cry that she has in Daisy's arms, which kind of adds a whole sort of like human foundation to that whole storyline when we're reaching the end of it. And then you've got the Daisy thing, where we have the one scene where she thinks, Charles is with another girl, and it turns out to be his sister, and it's like, oh, we've seen that before. But then it's when she dumps the fish on his car, and we're expecting this is the whole thing, they're going to break up, they're going to do this whole thing. But while they're standing there next to his car with the fish in it, like completely, practically destroying his car, they make up immediately. And in that moment, it is so incredibly refreshing to just sort of avoid conflict like that and address, oh, it was a misunderstanding, we can laugh about it. But then what's interesting about that is that's basically also them saving the conflict for when it's really important, which is something so many movies fail at miserably. They always want conflict now. But this movie is able to set that up and show that they can get through conflicts until there's a bigger one that maybe they can't. Or maybe one that's big enough for them that they can't handle it right away or instantly like that, or just laugh it off immediately. This moment where, once again, it's not what we expect it to be, when she goes to his family's house, where very young Matt Damon is, and what I want to say was his first movie also, I want to say. And he makes this big scene that you would think is this really big romantic gesture, where he calls out his family for making comments about her and about where she comes from and how she's poor, and they're obviously really rich and the total opposite. And it backfires on him because she realizes it was more of a selfish move than anything else, and it was like that was, basically just for him, and it was basically her. Basically, she was the stepping stone for him to be able to stand up to his family, and she might as well have not even been there. And the way she confronts that when this would usually be the big romantic gesture is like a really nice sort of curveball with that also. And then like what we talked about with JoJo, the Lily Taylor character, where it's like, where she has that big turnaround where her conflict is kind of all the things about her character like all in once, and the way they handle that just through performance rather than like, you know, writing convoluted shit for them to have to go through and all that. Is really great also. And then of course we've got, you know, side characters in this small town, and the whole town feels like really lived in. We've got little things going on to kind of help us get to an ending that at least gives us a big triumphant ending, even if there's one relationship that is obviously done for. It was hardly a relationship at all. Then there's one that's reconciled completely, and we finally get to see that wedding. And then there is the more or less uncertain one to an extent. So we've got to have like a sort of solidified happy ending, and that's where they kind of introduce the food critic thing, which might seem a bit tacked on, but it works. It's a nice triumphant moment regardless, even though you can kind of see it coming. I think the movie deviates enough from cliches that we can forgive it if it wants to give us, you know, some sort of mapped out happy ending. So there is that. So I do like Mystic Pizza and its characters a lot. But as far as choosing between these two, it's really no contest for me. If I haven't expressed enough how much I love Waitress, then you are deaf and blind. So that's pretty much all there is to that, I think. So I'm not entirely sure what the next one is, but there will be another one of these probably fairly soon, and another Stephen King thing, and whatever else we saw. We may try to decide to do some stuff at random. I don't know. But I think that's going to be it for this, so until whatever the next thing is, I think